First of all, I want to thank Biogen IDEC very much for supporting this program with an unrestricted grant, which means basically I can say what I'm going to say, which is really not related specifically to any of the treatments for MS, although we will talk about them in the context of what we talk about regarding the immune system. I want to say a quick word about the Multiple Sclerosis Research Institute. I started the Research Institute as a nonprofit foundation, and we have finally got to the point of developing our lab and are moving to move along all of our research programs. The primary focus of MSRI is research into the cause of multiple sclerosis, the way that current treatments work, and also to develop new treatments for multiple sclerosis. In addition to that, we do have an educational component, and this is one part of that educational component. What I'm going to do today is something that isn't usually done at MS programs. We're not going to talk about symptoms and a variety of things, or medications particularly. I'm going to focus primarily on the immune system, how the immune system normally works, and later on we'll get back to why the immune system doesn't function the way that it should function, that results in the development of MS, which is an autoimmune disease. One of the things that I think happens to people with MS is that they get very, very frustrated about what's going on, question whether the therapies work, whether we really know what we think we know or should know about MS. And MS, when all is said and done, is an immune disorder, and a disorder where the immune system actually turns in on one's own body, and particularly in the case of MS, myelin, which is part of the tissue of the brain, or one of the tissues in the brain, and is recognized by the immune system, reacted against, and that causes the illness MS. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about myelin today, just to mention it as we go along. What I'm really trying to do is help you understand the immune system, how it functions, and why it doesn't work in MS. And this is something that's not usually done, but is really very important for you to understand if you have MS, because it not only helps you understand the condition itself, it also helps you understand the treatments that we have for multiple sclerosis, where they might work and why they should or should not work if we're trying to develop them. So that's basically what I'm trying to do. I would like to try to go along without stopping if possible, but if you really have a pressing question, ask me. I'm going to stop before the end of about halfway and take questions then, and we will at the end. And at the end, we'll open it up to anything that may not even be related to what I talked about, but MS in general. A lot of the slides I'm going to show you come from an immunology textbook, and this is actually a very fine textbook, and so I want to give them credit. Each of the slides do have the copyright information on them. They very kindly allow people who are users to actually download them and use them for teaching purposes. And since they're so very good, it just didn't make any sense to reinvent the wheel. Now we're going to talk about the players of the immune system. And first of all, I'm showing you a picture here of a T cell. It kind of looks like a little ball that's fuzzy. It has these little fingers that stick out from it. And it's actually sitting on another cell that I'll introduce to you called a dendritic cell. And in fact, one of the things that you'll see as we go through this, and there's a theme in the immune system, is that cells communicate with one another when they're functioning. So that it isn't just one cell in isolation, it's in fact a number of cells that communicate. The T cell is also critical and central to multiple sclerosis, and we'll come back to that again and again as we go along. The other player, which was that cell down the bottom, is called a dendritic cell. You can see these little long fronds over here, almost like dendrites on nerve cells. That's why it was named that way. This was discovered in the 1970s by Ralph Steinman, who tragically died on the Friday before he was awarded the Nobel Prize this year on the Monday. He, against much skepticism for at least 10 years, basically established that these are critically important cells. And in fact, these are the cells that actually begin to generate an immune response. So they're kind of the people that, or the cells that kickstart the way the immune cells function and recognize what's going on. And we'll talk about how they recognize it, the world as we go along. Lymphocytes, which are T lymphocytes, which are those first cells, start off as little small cells like this, with very little of what we call cytoplasm around and a big nucleus, which is this very dark purple structure in the center. When they get activated, they enlarge like this, have a lot more cytoplasm, change, you can see the appearance of the nucleus and the cytoplasm, and become activated. And so microscopically, we can determine whether or not immune cells are actually activated. And they not only become activated, but as I'll show you as we go along, they begin to divide. And cell division is a critical part of the immune system, the way that the immune system expands in its ability to react against a given challenge, let's say a bacterium or a virus and so on. The other cell that we're not going to talk about a whole lot today is the B cell. The B cell makes antibodies, and even though oligoclonal bands, which you've probably heard about, are a part of diagnosing MS, they're actually today, we think, a rather peripheral player in what actually goes on in MS. And so we're not going to talk a huge amount about B cells, although there are some things we will mention as we go along. And finally, another cell, and again, we're not talking about all of the cells in the immune system. I try to be very selective and point out ones which I think are relevant to what we think about in MS. But this cell over here that has a sort of bean-shaped nucleus is called a macrophage or monocyte. When it gets activated, again, it kind of changes its appearance. But what it does is this cell sort of gobbles up all the garbage that gets left around, or when it breaks down a cell. And essentially, all of these little, what we call vesicles, show parts of cells or tissues or bacteria that have been ingested. And so this is the kind of destroyer, so to speak, of cells, the one that cleans up or breaks down things. So let's talk a little bit about how the immune system functions. And it really has two big components. One we call humoral immunity. This is the production of antibodies that you're all familiar with. Antibodies are proteins that bind, let's say, a microbe and help it on the way to it being ingested. T cells function in many different ways, but two major ways are, one, macrophages will, what we call phagocytose, that's eat up, let's say, for example, bacteria or microbes, and then pass on the message to other cells called helper T cells. These then collaborate with the macrophages and essentially activate a response that potentially could damage a tissue or clear out, let's say, a virus or bacterium. And finally, we have cells called cytotoxic cells or killer T cells. They recognize microbes that are actually inside cells. And there's a way that parts of those microbes can get put on the surface of that cell, and it's recognized by the killer cell. And I'll show you later on how they function. But when that cell recognizes an infected cell, it sets up a train of events that actually kills that cell. And so when we have a viral infection, let's say in our respiratory tract, part of the way that we get rid of the virus is to kill the cells it infects. And of course, the problem there is that that cell also potentially damages tissues, and part of the immune system is to modulate this and try to regulate the amount of destruction that occurs so that we don't all end up with a non-functioning tissue or non-functioning organ. So we have the B cells over here. The B cells, when they function, as I'd mentioned, produce antibodies. The antibodies set off a whole train of reactions which in and of themselves can help the body recognize microbes and get rid of them. Helper T cells come in a variety of flavors. In fact, it was called the Baskin-Robbins flavors. As you see, there's more than 35 flavors in the immune system, but there are many, many different kinds. And in the human immune system is extraordinarily versatile. So a cell can change its colors, whereas in mice, they tend to kind of pick, orange, blue, whatever, and just go along that particular path. So human cells can kind of change the way they function. And one of the ways that cells produce help is they actually secrete a whole bunch of proteins that we call cytokines. And cytokines act on a whole variety of cells and cause different kinds of actions, such as activating macrophages, bringing in inflammatory cells, or cells that, for example, would cause pus. We call them neutrophils, or activate a variety of T cells or B cells. We'd mentioned over here the cytotoxic T cells that go ahead and kill when they recognize that a cell is infected. And most important with regard to MS is that there's a cell called a regulatory T lymphocyte, which is one of the ways that the immune system actually puts the brakes on everything and calms it all down. And so you can't just activate something, cause destruction, without the capacity to prevent it or stop it when it isn't necessary. And so what this cell does essentially is it acts on other cells to prevent them from acting and becoming activated. So it's one of the checks and balances that happens in the immune system to help control everything. Now, one of the other things that's pretty amazing about the immune system is that we can start out in the beginning and be challenged with something we've never seen before. And through the process of recognizing what that thing is, the immune system is able to expand the number of cells that recognize what it is, whatever it is specifically. The cells go through a process not only of dividing, but what we call differentiating, which means they start taking on the function they're going to have. And then they eliminate whatever it is that needs to be eliminated. And at the end of this, some of the cells die off, but some of the cells survive as what we call memory cells. So that if you're challenged again, you don't have to go through this long process in as long a period of time as it took initially. It can happen very, very quickly. And the downside of this in the context of MS is that if you have more and more memory cells that recognize, let's say, a part of myelin, there's a greater chance they may be activated and cause a problem. So when you're fighting off a virus or a bacterium, you want this to happen really quickly, but you want it to stop. In the case of MS, you don't want it to happen, and we'll talk about how our bodies generally prevent these things from happening. But when it occurs, with the way that we try to treat people is to minimize the expansion of these cells or the activation of these cells. Now, many of the old treatments in MS, which essentially killed cells, will just go in here and do damage and kill cells fairly indiscriminately. And so the old drugs, let's say one cyclophosphamide or Cytoxan that you've heard about, acts in this fairly indiscriminate way and actually just gets rid of cells, rather than being very, very focused as a silver bullet to try to just attack an exact part of what's going wrong. And what we're trying to do in the immune system is not very different from what is going on, for example, in cancer treatment, where treatments are becoming very, very specific to specific kinds of cells or specific pathways in cells to help control what is a response that we don't want. The other thing that I just want to mention here is that what I'm talking about today primarily is what we call the adaptive immune system. Underlying the adaptive immune system is what we call the innate immune system. The innate immune system recognizes patterns of microbes, but not absolutely at a molecular specific way what that microbe is. It sort of is the first responder, so to speak, in the immune system. And it actually then educates the adaptive immune system. It's called adaptive because it can adapt. And I'll show you how it does that, where it can actually recognize molecules exquisitely down to very, very small dimensions in their shapes. And that's why we call it the adaptive immune system. It has the capacity to be flexible and recognize things at a very sophisticated level.